Hi, Guy. Tonight we're going somewhere different. Somewhere that exists between dream and waking, between what was real and what was imagined, between the world as it appeared and the world as one man saw it backward, in mirror script, in drawings that anticipated futures he would never live to see. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, but it's not the story you might expect. Not a list of achievements or a catalogue of paintings. It's something slower, something more like memory than history. A journey through candlelit workshops and forbidden chambers, through notebooks written in reverse and machines that dreamed of flight, through the mind of someone who saw connections where others saw only separation, who found unity in the diversity of knowledge, who spent a lifetime asking questions that would echo for centuries after his voice fell silent. So let the day dissolve. Let your thoughts slow like water finding its level. Let the noise of the world fade into something softer, something more like wondering than knowing. We have 12 chapters ahead, 12 meditations on genius and mystery, on the distances between vision and execution, on the beautiful incompleteness that defines so much of human striving. We begin with a mirror, with a hand that wrote backward, with script that could only be read when reflection translated it into something comprehensible. Because sometimes the truth only appears when we're willing to look at the world reversed, to see from the other side, to enter the mind that thought differently than others and never quite belonged to the time it inhabited. Close your eyes if you want. The story will find you either way. Let's begin. In a chamber lit by single candle, a left hand moved across parchment in manner that defied all convention, writing not forward but reversed, creating script that could only be read when held before glass, when reflection translated the backward symbols into comprehensible words. This was his secret language, though scholars still debate whether it was truly secret or simply natural to a hand that had learned to move against the world's direction. The notebooks accumulated through decades of observation and wondering. Thousands of pages filled with observations that flowed right to left, that hid themselves in plain sight, that required mirror to unlock their meaning. The script moved with fluid grace, not the labored writing of someone forcing unnatural motion, but the easy flow of habit, of a hand that had found its own way to record thought, and found that way more comfortable than the conventional direction everyone else employed. What did he protect through this backward script? The question has occupied scholars for centuries. Some suggest he was hiding dangerous knowledge, the anatomical drawings that showed human interior in detail that would have troubled the church, the mechanical designs that anticipated technologies centuries distant, the observations about natural phenomena that contradicted accepted wisdom. Others argue more simply. He was left-handed in an age that considered this sinister, literally so, from the Latin word for left. Writing in reverse prevented his hand from smudging the fresh ink, solved the practical problem that left-handed writers face when moving in the conventional direction. But perhaps the truth lies deeper than either explanation suggests. Perhaps the mirror writing was not concealment or convenience, but rather the external manifestation of a mind that perceived reality differently than others, that saw the world reversed or inverted, or from some angle that made the conventional perspective seem arbitrary and limiting. It is said that to read his notebooks, to truly read them, not just to decipher the words, but to follow the movement of thought, one must learn to think backward, to let the eyes move right to left, to allow the reversed script to become natural. Some scholars report that after days or weeks of immersion in the mirror writing, they begin to dream in reversed script, to find their own thoughts wanting to flow in that direction, to understand why a mind might choose this path rather than the conventional one. In candlelit studios in Florence and Milan, in rented rooms in Rome, in the French manor where he would spend his final years, the mirror writing continued. Observations about water and wind, about the way light falls on sphere, about the architecture of bird wings and the geometry of human skull. Notes about paintings in progress and machines imagined. Shopping lists and mathematical calculations. Philosophical reflections and bawdy jokes. All recorded in script that required mirror to translate, that existed in constant state of reversal, that was simultaneously hidden and completely visible, protected only by the assumption that writing should flow in one direction and no other. Whispers tell us that the notebooks contain secrets still. Pages that remain untranslated, not because the script is indecipherable, but because the handwriting was hurried, the words faded by time and handling, the ink degraded by 5 centuries of existence in varying conditions of light and humidity and care. Some pages were damaged by water or fire, some were cut up and dispersed, sold as individual leaves to collectors who valued the drawings more than the context, who saw isolated image rather than part of larger investigation. And in those untranslated passages, in those damaged or dispersed pages, who knows what observations remain hidden, what mechanical principles he discovered but could not build for lack of materials or patronage, what anatomical insights he recorded but never published because publication would have invited scrutiny he preferred to avoid, what questions he asked that we have not yet learned to answer. Beneath the silence of archives and libraries where the notebooks now rest in Windsor Castle and the British Library, in the Louvre and the Ambrosiana, scattered across Europe in collections that would have horrified him with their fragmentation, their separation of pages that belonged together, their treatment of his unified investigation as discrete objects to be catalogued and displayed beneath that archival silence, the mirror writing waits. It waits for eyes willing to look backward, to read against convention's flow, to enter the mind that thought in reversal and wonder what truths might live there still. Not hidden in any sinister sense, not concealed by code or cipher, but simply protected by the accident of direction, by the choice to write left-handed in a right-handed world, by the decision, conscious or unconscious, to let thoughts flow in the direction that felt natural, even if that direction was opposite to everyone else's. The mirror holds its reflection patient and unchanging. Glass has no preference for forward or backward, no judgment about which direction is correct. It simply reverses what it receives, translates without commentary, shows us how the world looks from the other side. And in that reversal, in that patient reflection, the mirror becomes teacher, shows us that perspective is choice, that there are always multiple ways to see, that what seems backward from one angle might be forward from another. Perhaps this is the deeper secret of the mirror writing, not what it concealed, but what it revealed. That Leonardo saw the world from angles others did not consider, that his mind moved in directions that felt unnatural to conventional thinkers, that what appeared to be eccentricity or concealment was actually closer to his truth, his natural mode of perceiving and recording reality. Where memory fades into the particular examples, this drawing of a flying machine, that observation about the moon's light being reflected sunlight, these calculations about the volume of sphere, there remains the essential pattern. The mind that thought backward, the hand that wrote reversed, the notebooks that require mirror to unlock. And in that reversal, in that requirement of reflection to achieve comprehension, perhaps the invitation to look at the world differently, to question the assumption that there is one correct way to see or think or record, to recognize that genius often operates from perspectives that seem strange until we learn to shift our own angle of vision and see what the genius saw. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The mirror writing echoes still not in sound but in image, in the thousands of pages that wait in libraries, in the script that flows right to left, in the invitation to look backward and find that backward might be forward, that reversed might be natural, that the world contains more than one direction and genius often moves in the direction no one else thought to try. The candle burned low in those long-ago workshops, casting shadows that moved as flame flickered. The hand continued writing, swift, confident, moving in its chosen direction without hesitation or doubt. And the mirror waited as mirrors do, ready to translate whenever someone held the page before glass and let the backward become forward, let the hidden become visible, let the secret reveal itself to anyone patient enough to look from the other side. Where the mirror holds its reflection, truth lives inverted, not false, just reversed. Not concealed, just requiring different angle to perceive. And in that inversion, in that requirement of reflection to achieve understanding, the notebooks offer their deepest lesson, that truth has no single orientation, that wisdom can flow in any direction, that the path to understanding sometimes requires us to turn around, to look backward, to see the world as mirror shows it, reversed but recognizable, backward but beautiful, strange but ultimately, finally true. The hand that wrote backward has been dust for 5 centuries, but the script remains, patient, reversed, waiting for the next mirror, the next reflection, the next mind willing to look backward and discover that backward is simply another word for seeing differently, for thinking beyond convention, for recording truth in whatever direction it naturally flows. It is said that he descended into morgues and charnel houses where the dead waited for burial or dissection, where the boundary between sacred vessel and mere flesh had already been crossed by death itself, where the Church's prohibition against violating the body met the investigator's need to understand what life left behind. In darkness barely touched by lamplight, in spaces that smelled of death and preservation, In rooms where the only sound was his own breathing and the scratch of charcoal on paper, he studied what remains when spirit departs. The architecture of bone, the mapping of vein and artery, the hidden clockwork that animated flesh until consciousness ceased and only mechanism remained. This was forbidden territory, not legally perhaps, not always, but morally, theologically, in the deep sense that the body was temple, was sacred container, was not meant to be opened and examined and rendered in drawing after careful drawing that showed layer beneath layer, surface beneath surface, the interior geography that no one was supposed to see. The Church's position was clear, if not always consistently enforced. The body was divinely created, made in God's image, and therefore not subject to casual investigation. Dissection might be permitted in limited circumstances for medical education under strict supervision, for legal purposes when foul play was suspected. But the casual opening of bodies to satisfy curiosity, to answer questions about how muscle moved bone or how blood circulated or how the eye captured light, this was transgression, was the confusion of categories between the sacred and the profane, was treating holy vessel as mere machine to be disassembled and understood. Yet he descended into the spaces where death was processed and prepared, into the rooms where bodies waited, into the silence where his questions mattered more than the prohibitions, where understanding was worth the risk of censure or worse, where the systematic pursuit of knowledge overrode the theological concerns that would have stopped a more conventional mind. Whispers tell us that his drawings show interiors with precision that would not be matched for centuries. The chambers of the heart rendered with accuracy that medical science would later confirm, not through guessing or copying from texts, but through direct observation, through the patient sketching of what he saw when he opened the chest cavity and examined the organ still visible in its arrested state. The fetus curled in womb, shown in cross-section that revealed the relationship between developing life and maternal body, that demonstrated his understanding of gestation's mechanics without benefit of microscope or modern imaging. The layers of scalp and skull protecting the brain's mysterious matter, each tissue distinct, each layer serving its function, all of them drawn with an accuracy that suggests he saw with more than eyes, that he understood not just appearance but principle. Where did he find these bodies? The historical record is murky, deliberately so perhaps. Some scholars suggest hospitals provided them quietly unclaimed bodies of paupers or criminals, people whose deaths left no one to object to their corpses serving science. Others propose he worked with executed criminals, whose bodies were sometimes available for dissection as extension of their punishment, as final service the condemned could render to living. Still others whisper of graves disturbed, of bodies borrowed from their rest for duration of study, and then returned before dawn, before anyone could notice their temporary absence from the earth. The truth has faded into the general darkness of history. What remains are the drawings, evidence of transgression in service of understanding, of boundaries crossed because the question mattered more than the prohibition. The human hand rendered in multiple layers skin, then fat and connective tissue, then the intricate webbing of tendons that translate finger motion into the manipulation that defines human capability. The spine shown from multiple angles, each vertebra distinct, the spaces between them illustrated, the curvature that allows upright posture documented. The lungs, the liver, the digestive tract, all examined and recorded with a precision that came only from direct observation, from hours spent in the presence of opened bodies, from the willingness to look closely at what death revealed. It is said that he dissected more than 30 bodies over the years. 30 individuals who had been alive, who had contained consciousness and memory, and the ineffable quality that made them persons rather than merely flesh. 30 transitions from subject to object, from sacred vessel to investigative material. The number seems both large and small because each dissection represented significant investment of time and risk. Small because the understanding he achieved from those 30 examinations influenced centuries of medical knowledge, changed how humanity understood its own physical form. Beneath the silence of those forbidden chambers, beneath the lamplight that barely pushed back darkness, beneath the awareness that what he was doing violated conventions and risked consequences, beneath all this, what did he feel? Was there reverence? Did he acknowledge, even silently, that these had been people, that he was privileged to witness their interior architecture, that the knowledge he gained came at cost borne by others who had not volunteered, who had not chosen to become subjects of his investigation? The drawings give no answer. They are clinical, precise, focused on structure rather than sentiment. But between the drawings, in the mirror-written notes that accompany them, occasionally a phrase suggests awareness, a comment about the beauty of design, an observation about the elegance of the solution nature found to particular problem. A recognition that the body's engineering serves purposes beyond mere mechanism, that there is something almost miraculous in the way disparate systems coordinate to produce consciousness, sensation, the capacity for thought and feeling, and all that makes us human. In the chamber of forbidden bodies, he learned the sacred geometry of human form, the divine proportions that govern limb and organ, the engineering that makes flesh capable of housing consciousness. And in learning, perhaps he discovered something about the relationship between matter and spirit, about how the mechanical enables the miraculous, about the thin veil separating body from soul. The boundary was not as clear as theology suggested. Spirit did not simply inhabit body the way tenant inhabits house. The two were more intimately connected. Body's structure influenced consciousness, brain's anatomy shaped thought's possibilities, the physical constraints determined what the immaterial could accomplish. To understand body was, in some sense, to understand person. To map the interior was to chart the territory where spirit operated. To render the hidden visible was to illuminate the stage where consciousness performed. Perhaps this is why the Church objected not from squeamishness about opened bodies, but from deeper concern about what such investigation implied, that humanity was mechanism as well as spirit, that the divine image could be understood through systematic examination, that the sacred could be mapped and drawn and comprehended rather than merely revered from distance. Where memory fades into the scattered evidence drawings in Windsor, notes in Milan, records that suggest but do not confirm, prohibitions that were issued but may not have been enforced, there remains the essential transgression. He opened what was meant to stay closed, examined what was meant to remain mysterious, recorded what was meant to be known only to God and the person who had inhabited the flesh. And in that transgression, knowledge was born, medical understanding advanced. Future generations would build on his observations, would confirm his accuracy, would recognize that his systematic investigation had revealed truths that textbooks and received wisdom had missed or misrepresented. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The bodies speak still, not in any supernatural sense, not as ghosts or spirits, but through the drawings that preserved their interior architecture, through the observations that translated their physical form into understanding, through the knowledge that their involuntary service to science produced. They speak of the courage required to look closely at what others preferred to ignore, of the systematic attention that saw not just horror or fascination but information, principle, the underlying order that governs all flesh regardless of whose flesh it is, of the recognition that understanding sometimes requires transgression, that boundaries exist to be questioned, that the distance between ignorance and knowledge sometimes passes through chambers we are told not to enter. The dead kept their final secret where consciousness goes when body ceases, what happens to the ineffable quality that made them persons rather than merely assemblies of tissue and bone. But they yielded everything else. It showed him how heart chambers, how blood flows, how muscle attaches to bone, how the eye's lens focuses light, how every system serves and supports, how the body is not single thing but collaboration of countless processes working in coordination so perfect it seems intentional, designed, divine. In the chamber of forbidden bodies, the boundary blurred between sacred and profane, between person and mechanism, between what faith declared and what observation revealed. And in that blurring, in that zone of uncertainty where he worked by lamplight among the dead, understanding was born, difficult, transgressive, forbidden, but undeniably valuable, undeniably true. The chambers are empty now, the bodies long since buried or scattered, the lamplight extinguished. But the drawings remain witness to what he learned in those forbidden spaces, evidence of the systematic investigation that would not stop at boundaries, testament to the conviction that understanding was worth the risk, that knowledge justified the transgression, that the human form was worthy of close study regardless of the theological objections. Where the forbidden was examined, mystery yielded. Not completely, some questions remain unanswered, some observations were wrong, some understanding awaited technologies he could not imagine. But yielded enough, yielded sufficient understanding to change how humanity saw itself, to advance medical knowledge by centuries, to prove that the systematic investigation of even forbidden subjects could produce results that justified the courage required to enter the chamber and look closely at what death revealed. High in rented rooms with windows facing sky, he sketched machines that would lift human weight into air contraptions of wood and canvas, of lever and pulley, of human muscle amplified through mechanical advantage into something approaching flight. The obsession began, as so many of his investigations began, with patient observation. Birds wheeling overhead, bats flickering through Florentine evening. The way wing beat translated into lift, the geometry of feathers catching air. The angle at which surfaces met wind to generate the force that defied gravity's ancient claim on all earthbound things. If nature could accomplish flight through evolved form, he reasoned, then human engineering might replicate the principle through crafted mechanism. This was not fantasy or wishful thinking, but systematic extrapolation from observed phenomena. Birds flew, this was undeniable. They possessed no magic, no divine dispensation, nothing beyond physical form shaped by ages of selection into configuration that worked. If birds could fly through natural engineering, then artificial engineering might accomplish the same result given sufficient understanding of forces and forms. The notebooks filled with wing designs. Pages and pages of sketches showing variations on the basic principle, some mimicking bird anatomy directly, with articulated structures that moved like natural wings, others extrapolating principles into configurations nature had never attempted, applying human understanding of leverage and force to create wings that did not copy but interpreted, that took nature's solution as inspiration rather than template. It is said that the ornithopter designs machines with wings that would flap rather than remaining fixed, became his primary focus for years of investigation. These were not casual sketches, but detailed engineering drawings showing how human body would interface with mechanism, how arm and leg motion would translate through clever linkage into the wing beat that might, that should, that almost certainly would generate sufficient lift to raise human weight into the realm that birds owned exclusively. The pilot would lie prone, he decided, to minimize wind resistance. Arms would work levers that pulled the wings leading edge downward. Legs would drive pedals that controlled the trailing edge and perhaps also provided power for the upstroke. The entire body's strength, not just arms or just legs, but the coordinated effort of whole person would be required because the wing's surface area needed to be substantial, needed to move enough air to generate lift sufficient for human weight plus machine weight, needed to overcome not just gravity but also air resistance and the mechanical inefficiencies inevitable in any system of levers and pulleys and flexible joints. Whispers tell us that he built models. Small demonstration pieces that showed how the linkages worked, how the wing surfaces articulated, how force applied here translated into motion there. Some scholars suggest he attempted full-scale construction, that somewhere in the hills outside Florence or Milan he tested these machines, that he or brave assistants actually tried to fly using ornithopters of wood and canvas, launching from hillside or tower in the desperate hope that theory would translate into actual flight. But there is no record of success, no documented flight, no witness testimony that says, "I saw Leonardo da Vinci or his assistant rise into air on mechanical wings and fly, actually fly even briefly, even just a few feet above ground." The silence suggests that if attempts were made, they ended in failure. The wings did not generate sufficient lift, or the control proved impossible. Or the mechanism was too heavy, the pilot too weak, the understanding not quite complete enough to bridge the gap between theory and actual flight. Yet the investigation mattered. The systematic observation of birds in flight, the careful notation of wing shape and motion, the mechanical analysis of how surfaces meeting air at particular angles generate forces that can lift weight. All of this approached the principles that would eventually, 4 centuries later, enable powered flight. His understanding was incomplete. He did not fully grasp the importance of lift-to-drag ratio, did not recognize that flapping was perhaps the most difficult way to achieve flight, did not have access to engines that could provide power beyond what human muscle could generate. But he was closer to understanding than anyone before him, closer to translating observation into working theory, closer to the day when humans would actually fly. Beneath the silence of those high rooms where he worked on wing designs, where models hung from ceiling beams or lay disassembled on workbenches, where drawings accumulated showing variation after variation beneath that working silence, what sustained the obsession? Why invest so much time and effort in machines that did not work, in designs that remained theoretical, in the pursuit of flight that seemed always just beyond reach? Perhaps because the question mattered. Because flight represented ultimate liberation from earthbound constraint. Because if humans could fly, the world would become different, place distances would shrink, geography would transform, the very nature of human experience would change. Or perhaps more simply because the problem was solvable, seemed solvable, appeared to be merely a matter of sufficient understanding and clever engineering, and he could not let go of solvable problems even when the solution remained elusive. The drawings show remarkable attention to detail, not just the overall wing structure but the small components, the joints that would need to flex without breaking, the materials that would provide strength without excessive weight, the control surfaces that would allow the pilot to steer. He understood that flight was not single problem but collection of related challenges, each requiring solution before the whole could function. And there is beauty in the drawings, not just technical beauty, though that is present, but aesthetic beauty. The wings sketched with care that transcends mere engineering, with attention to proportion and curve that suggests he saw not just function but form, not just mechanism but the elegance of well-designed solution. The ornithopters are lovely on the page even if they never flew in reality, are worthy of contemplation even if they failed in practice. Where memory fades into speculation about whether he ever actually attempted flight, about which designs might have been built and tested, about how close he came to success, there remains the essential contribution. He systematized the investigation, transformed flight from myth and aspiration into engineering problem. It showed that birds flew through explainable principles rather than magic, that those principles could be discovered through patient observation, that human flight might be achievable given sufficient understanding and appropriate mechanism. The workshop where wings were born produced no flying machines that carried him or anyone else aloft on mechanical wings, but it produced knowledge, produced questions refined through systematic observation. It produced the recognition that flight was solvable problem rather than divine impossibility, that the sky's boundary could be crossed given sufficient understanding of forces and forms. Perhaps the failure was necessary. Perhaps actual success would have been premature, would have encouraged others to attempt flight with inadequate understanding and insufficient technology, leading to injuries or deaths that might have set back the investigation for generations. Perhaps the drawings needed to wait in notebooks until humanity developed the materials and power sources and mathematical understanding that would make flight actually achievable rather than merely theoretically possible. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The wings whisper still in the drawings that show such careful observation, in the mechanical linkages that demonstrate such clear understanding of force and motion, in the persistence that continued designing variations even when success remained elusive. They whisper that the pursuit matters as much as the achievement, that the systematic investigation yields understanding even when it does not yield immediate results, that the distance between impossible and actual is crossed through accumulated observations and refined theories even when the crossing takes centuries. The high windows that faced sky are gone. The workshops are scattered into memory. The ornithopter models, if they existed, have long since disintegrated into dust and fragments. But the drawings remain, wings sketched on paper, mechanisms that never flew but that approached flight, designs that anticipated the day when humans would actually rise on wings of their own making and join the birds in that realm that had always seemed beyond reach. And in those sketches, in those careful drawings of wings and linkages, in the systematic investigation of how flight might be achieved there, the future was already present, not realized, not fulfilled, but implicit, waiting, ready to be born when technology and understanding finally matured to the point where theory could translate into actual wings, carrying actual humans into air that had always been birds' domain exclusively. Where wonder dwelt in those high rooms, possibility was sketched on paper. And the sketches persist, patient, beautiful evidence that genius sometimes consists not of achieving the impossible, but of showing that the impossible is merely difficult, merely a matter of sufficient understanding and appropriate technology, merely waiting for the moment when observation and theory and capability converge. The workshop where wings were born gave birth to knowledge rather than working machines. But knowledge is its own form of flight, lifting understanding above common assumptions, soaring beyond conventional wisdom, proving that the sky's limit is not final boundary but challenge awaiting systematic investigation by minds willing to look up and ask, why not? How might this be accomplished? What principles govern flight, and how might those principles be harnessed for human use? The questions remain, the drawings persist. And the wings, though they never flew, continue to inspire, reminding us that the distance between dream and reality is measured not in inspiration alone, but in patient observation, in careful drawing, in systematic variation and refinement, in the willingness to pursue understanding even when achievement remains elusive, even when the goal stays just beyond reach, even when success waits for future generations to finally accomplish what the genius could only imagine and sketch and dream. She sits in eternal patience, hands folded, lips curved in expression that has haunted viewers for 5 centuries, suggesting knowledge, suggesting mystery, suggesting that she knows something the observer does not and never will. The Mona Lisa gazes from her panel with eyes that seem to follow, that seem aware despite being merely paint and varnish, that achieve through his technique something approaching actual presence. It is said that the painting was never finished, or rather was never abandoned, never reached the state where he could say, "It is complete, it needs nothing more, I can deliver it to whoever commissioned it and move on to other work." Instead, it remained with him, traveled with him from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, was refined and adjusted and reconsidered through decades of possession, became companion piece, became the artwork he could not or would not complete because completion would mean ending the conversation between painter and subject, between intention and execution, between vision and the reality of pigment on panel. What is the secret of her smile? The scholars have proposed countless theories through the centuries since the painting entered the Louvre, since it became perhaps the most famous artwork in human history, since it became icon reproduced and parodied and analyzed, until the original became difficult to see beneath the layers of interpretation. Some suggested she was pregnant, that the slight fullness of face and the particular quality of expression captured the inward awareness of carrying new life. Others proposed she had just received joyful news, or had heard an amusing remark, or was simply in pleasant mood when he sketched the initial composition. But perhaps the secret is not in her expression but in his perception. The ability to see not fixed state but transition, not single emotion but the fluid movement between failings, the recognition that human expression is never static but always becoming, always hovering between one state and another. This was the innovation of sfumato, the technique of blurring edges, of avoiding hard lines, of building form through subtle gradations of tone rather than through defined boundaries. The result was faces that seemed alive, that appeared to shift slightly when looked at from different angles or in different lights, that possessed the ambiguity of actual human expression rather than the frozen quality of conventional portraiture. Whispers tell us that the painting occupied him for years, perhaps for the rest of his life. Not continuously, there were other projects, other paintings, other investigations into anatomy and engineering, and the countless subjects that captured his restless attention. But repeatedly, regularly, he would return to the panel, would make small adjustments, would apply thin layers of glaze that subtly modified tone or shadow, would refine the background landscape or adjust the fall of light on fabric, would work the surface with such delicacy that no brush strokes remain visible, that the image seems to have formed itself rather than being constructed through patient application of pigment. She was never delivered to whoever commissioned her. The historical record suggests that Francesco del Giocondo, a Florentine merchant, commissioned the portrait of his wife Lisa, hence La Gioconda, hence Mona Lisa, the title that has become synonymous with artistic mystery. But Leonardo never delivered the finished work, never collected full payment, kept the painting in his possession until his death in France decades after the commission was made. Why? Perhaps because it was never finished to his satisfaction. Perhaps because he recognized that this painting achieved something special, represented breakthrough in technique and expression that made it too valuable to surrender for the agreed fee. Perhaps because Lisa Gherardini became for him not person but symbol, not portrait of individual woman but meditation on human consciousness, on the ineffable quality that makes each person unique, on the mystery of awareness looking out through eyes at a world that looks back. Beneath the silence of those years when the panel traveled with him wrapped carefully, protected from damage, brought out periodically for refinement or simply for contemplation beneath that portable presence, what relationship developed between painter and painted? She became, in some sense, mirror of his own mind. The smile was his perception of smile, the expression was filtered through his understanding of human emotion, the presence was as much his creation as her reality. The background landscape is strange, dreamlike, mountains that don't quite match, a bridge that leads nowhere particular, water that seems both liquid and atmospheric. This is not realistic representation of Tuscan countryside, but rather idealized or imagined landscape, the kind of setting that exists more in thought than in geography. The disconnect between the realistic portrait and the fantastical background creates tension, suggests that she exists simultaneously in actual world and in realm of imagination, that the painting operates in that liminal space between representation and invention. It is said that the painting's fame is partly accident of history. It was relatively unknown for centuries, valued by those who knew art but not broadly recognized. Then in 1911 it was stolen from the Louvre by Italian handyman who believed it should be returned to Italy. The theft made international news, created sensation, transformed the painting from artwork into cultural phenomenon. When it was recovered 2 years later, it returned to the Louvre not as simply painting but as the painting, the most famous artwork in the world, the symbol of artistic achievement. But perhaps the fame is also earned. Perhaps viewers recognize something in the smile that transcends the particular woman who posed, that speaks to larger questions about consciousness and expression and the mystery of human awareness. The ambiguity is invitation to wonder what she's thinking, to project onto that expression our own understanding of emotion, to participate in the creation of meaning rather than simply receiving predetermined message. Where memory fades into the accumulated interpretations, the psychoanalytic readings, the technical analyses, the historical investigations into who she was and why the painting was never delivered there remains the essential encounter. Viewer and viewed, the smile that seems to shift, the eyes that appear to follow, the presence that seems almost alive despite being nothing more than pigment carefully applied to prepared wood panel 5 centuries ago. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The painting speaks, though it has no voice, speaks through the ambiguous expression, through the sfumato technique that makes edges uncertain, through the disconnect between realistic figure and fantastic landscape. It speaks of mysteries that resist explanation, the nature of consciousness, the ineffable quality of personhood, the distance between surface appearance and interior reality. The smile remains patient and knowing. That suggests that some secrets are meant to stay secret, that mystery serves purpose beyond mere concealment, that the unanswerable question might be more valuable than the certain answer. She knows something we don't or appears to know, which amounts to the same thing when the appearance is so skillfully created, when the technique is so subtle that the illusion becomes indistinguishable from reality. Perhaps she knows nothing. Perhaps she is simply pigment arranged by genius to create impression of knowledge, appearance of awareness, suggestion of presence. But if so, then the genius lies precisely in this creation, in the ability to make the viewer believe in the presence of consciousness, to feel that those painted eyes actually see, that the slight smile actually signifies something, that behind the surface there exists actual person rather than clever arrangement of tones and colors. The painting hangs in the Louvre behind bulletproof glass, surrounded by crowds, photographed thousands of times daily, reproduced on postcards and posters and products until the image has become so familiar it's difficult to actually see the original. But the original persists beneath the fame, beneath the reproductions, beneath the countless interpretations, still patient, still mysterious, still holding whatever secret the smile suggests it holds. And in that holding, in that patient maintenance of mystery across 5 centuries, the painting fulfills its purpose. Not to answer questions, but to ask them. Not to resolve ambiguity, but to preserve it. Not to explain consciousness, but to represent it, the ineffable quality that makes each person unique, the mystery that looks out through eyes at world that looks back, the smile that suggests knowledge whether that knowledge exists or not. Where wonder meets uncertainty, art dwells. And the Mona Lisa dwells in that space perfectly, eternally, reminding us that the greatest achievements sometimes consist not of providing answers, but of asking questions that continue resonating long after the questioner has fallen silent, long after the subject has passed beyond, long after everything except the painting itself has faded into history. The smile persists, patient, ambiguous, knowing or appearing to know. And in that persistence, in that continued ability to capture attention and provoke wonder, the painting demonstrates its deepest truth. That art matters not because it resolves mysteries, but because it preserves them, not because it explains consciousness, but because it represents it so skillfully that the representation becomes its own form of presence, its own form of immortality, its own form of the smile that holds a secret and never ever tells. On the wall of a monastery dining hall in Milan, he painted the last meal shared before everything changed. 13 figures gathered around table, the moment frozen just after words were spoken that would shatter the gathering's peace. One of you will betray me. The apostles react in various ways: shock, denial, confusion, the physical recoil from terrible knowledge, the turning toward each other in question and accusation. But even as he created the scene, even as the image took form on the wall through 3 years of patient work, the painting itself was betraying him, the technique he chose dooming the masterpiece even as he brought it into being. It is said that he rejected true fresco, rejected the ancient method that required painter to work quickly on wet plaster, to complete each section in single day before the surface dried, to make all decisions in advance because the technique allowed no revision, no refinement, no slow consideration of how each element should relate to all others. True fresco demanded speed and certainty, and he possessed neither, or rather, possessed them only in inverse measure to what the technique required. His genius was slow, contemplative, revising. He needed time to consider, to adjust, to refine until the image matched his vision. So he invented a different method: oil and tempera on dry wall, painted not directly on plaster but on a layer of preparation he hoped would accept the pigment and preserve the image. This allowed him to work slowly, to paint and repaint, to adjust a gesture here or modify an expression there, to build the composition through patient accumulation rather than rapid execution. It allowed him 3 years of work where fresco would have demanded 3 weeks. It allowed refinement that achieved psychological depth unprecedented in wall painting, that made each apostle distinct not just in appearance but in character, that captured the moment of crisis with such power that viewers for centuries would study the faces trying to determine which figure was Judas, which one bore the guilt even before the betrayal occurred. But the paint would not bond properly. Even before he finished, even while he still worked on the composition, the surface was deteriorating. Within decades, the image was flaking, fragments of paint falling away, the faces he had so carefully rendered becoming obscured or lost, the scene that was meant to last for centuries already showing the damage that would eventually require restoration after restoration. Layer upon layer of intervention that would transform the original surface into palimpsest, into archaeological site where successive generations tried to preserve what he had created while inevitably altering it in the process. Whispers tell us that perhaps this was fitting. Perhaps a painting about betrayal and impermanence, about the fragility of fellowship and the inevitability of transformation, should itself be impermanent, should itself betray the painter's intention, should itself demonstrate that nothing endures unchanged, that even the greatest attempts to fix moment impermanence must eventually surrender to entropy and time. The composition is revolutionary. The linear perspective draws the eye toward the central figure, Christ calm at the center while chaos radiates outward, the apostles grouped in clusters of 3 on either side, each group showing different aspect of reaction to the terrible announcement. Some lean away from the center, others lean in. Some gesture emphatically, others sit in stunned stillness. The psychological complexity is remarkable. These are not stock figures or conventional representations, but individuals responding in character to crisis, each reaction revealing something about personality, about the relationship to the central figure, about how different temperaments process devastating news. And the light. The way illumination enters from the left, casting shadows that define form and create depth, that make the painted wall seem to recede into actual space, that transforms flat surface into architectural extension of the room, where monks gathered to eat their own meals beneath this scene of the Last Supper before everything changed. Beneath the silence of that refectory, for it is silent now mostly, a museum space rather than working monastery, a destination for tourists rather than gathering place for religious community. Beneath that current silence, layers of past silence accumulate. The silence of monks eating beneath the image, contemplating the scene as they took their own meals, considering their own capacity for betrayal or loyalty. The silence of Leonardo working alone on scaffolding, his hand moving slowly across the wall, adding detail here and adjusting proportion there, working through the night sometimes because the light was good or because the figure would not resolve itself correctly until he had tried and failed and tried again. It is said that he often stood before the wall for hours without touching brush to surface, simply looking, considering, deciding. The prior of the monastery complained to the Duke of Milan, who had commissioned the work, "The painter wastes time, standing idle when he should be working, taking wages without producing results." But Leonardo understood what the prior did not, that the actual application of paint was smallest part of the work, that the real labor was in the seeing and considering, in the slow accumulation of decision that preceded any mark made on surface. Where memory fades into the technical details of conservation, efforts the attempts to arrest the deterioration, to stabilize what remains, to remove later overpainting while preserving original surface, where it still exists there remains the essential paradox. The painting that was meant to last has been disappearing since it was created. The image that was supposed to preserve the moment for eternity has required constant intervention to survive even partially. The masterpiece is also failure, is also demonstration that intention and execution exist in constant tension, that what we hope to accomplish and what actually results are different things, that the gap between vision and reality admits no perfect bridge. Yet it endures, damaged, restored, over-restored, partially lost, partially reconstructed by conservators working from old copies and written descriptions. It endures. Not in the pristine state he left it, assuming there was ever moment when he considered it truly finished, but as record of ambition, as demonstration of what wall painting could achieve in psychological depth and compositional sophistication, as meditation on betrayal and fellowship, and the moment when community fractures under the weight of knowledge that one among them will betray everything they represent. The wall crumbles slowly. The paint continues flaking despite all efforts at conservation. A time and humidity and the simple fact of existence in material world where nothing remains unchanged, all of this continues the degradation that began almost as soon as he applied paint to wall. Perhaps in another century, another few centuries, the image will be gone entirely except in reproductions, in the countless photographs and copies that have been made, in the memory of what once existed on that refectory wall. But for now it remains, faded, damaged, heavily restored, but recognizable. The central figure still calm, the apostles still reacting, the moment still frozen in that instant after the terrible words were spoken, before the future they announced had actually arrived, in the suspended time between revelation and consequence when everything has changed but nothing has happened yet. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The Last Supper speaks of impermanence while trying to create permanence, of betrayal while attempting fidelity to vision, of the gap between what we intend and what we accomplish. It speaks through its very deterioration, through the restoration efforts that try to preserve while inevitably altering, through the transformation of original into palimpsest where layers of intervention obscure while attempting to reveal. The feast where betrayal was painted is becoming ghost of itself. The wall still stands. The image persists in some form, but the actual surface Leonardo created, the precise tones and edges and relationships he established through 3 years of patient work, these exist now more in reconstruction than in fact, more in conservation efforts than in original paint, more in the idea of what was there than in what can actually be seen. Perhaps this is the painting's final lesson, that nothing endures unchanged, that even the greatest achievements must surrender eventually to time and transformation. That the attempt to fix moment in permanence is noble but finally impossible, that material existence admits no exceptions, that everything made by human hands will eventually return to dust or require such intervention to preserve it that the preservation becomes its own form of transformation. Where wonder and loss meet, the Last Supper dwells, still teaching, still demonstrating, still showing that the distance between intention and result is measured not just in technical skill, but in the simple fact of existing in world where time corrodes, where walls crumble, where paint flakes away no matter how skillfully applied, where permanence is always temporary and the best we can achieve is the slow surrender rather than the sudden loss. The refectory wall holds what remains. The monks who once ate beneath it are dust. Leonardo, who painted it, has been dust for 5 centuries. But the image persists in some form, some version, some reconstruction that approximates what he created, that preserves enough to convey the power of the original, that allows us still to stand before the wall and see, however faintly, however mediated by conservation efforts, the moment he captured, the crisis he rendered, the betrayal he painted while technique betrayed him, while the wall failed to hold what he gave it. While impermanence demonstrated itself through the very act of trying to create permanence. And in that persistence despite everything, in that survival through constant intervention, in that continued ability to move viewers despite heavy restoration and significant loss, there, the painting achieves its own form of immortality, not the pristine survival he might have hoped for, but survival nonetheless, damaged but present, faded but recognizable. Lost and lost again and found again through endless conservation efforts that will continue as long as any trace remains on that Milanese wall. The feast continues. The betrayal is always just about to happen. The moment holds barely, preserved more by human devotion than by the technique that was supposed to make it last forever, but instead guaranteed it would require forever maintenance, forever intervention, forever the loving attention of those who recognize that what remains is worth preserving even in diminished form, even as ghost of its former self, even as the painting betrays itself while depicting betrayal, even as impermanence proves itself through the medium meant to create permanence. In margins of notebooks, between anatomical studies and botanical observations, military engines took shape, devices of siege and defense, of calculated destruction, of human ingenuity applied to the ancient problem of how to break walls and protect cities, how to amplify force and deflect attack, how to make war more efficient and therefore more terrible. He served dukes and princes who needed military engineering as much as they needed art, who valued his ability to design fortifications and siege weapons alongside his capacity to paint and sculpt and entertain court with mechanical marvels. It is said that when he sought employment with Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, his letter of introduction barely mentioned his artistic abilities. Instead, it was catalogue of military capabilities. He could design portable bridges for armies, could create bombards and mortars, could develop armored vehicles, could engineer systems for undermining walls and defending against undermining, could provide all the technical knowledge necessary for making war successfully. The art was almost afterthought, mentioned briefly at the end, subordinate to the military engineering that he knew would capture the Duke's interest more reliably than promises of beautiful paintings. The designs are simultaneously brilliant and disturbing. Tanks propelled by human muscle, armored shells protecting soldiers as they approached enemy positions, the shell constructed to deflect projectiles, the interior fitted with cranks and gears that would translate human effort into the rotation of wheels, allowing the vehicle to advance slowly but inexorably toward walls or fortifications that needed breaching. Giant crossbows that could hurl projectiles farther than conventional weapons, the bow stretched across framework taller than a man, the tension so great that it required mechanical advantage to draw, the release so violent that the entire structure would recoil despite being anchored to ground. Whispers tell us about the scythed chariots, war carts fitted with rotating blades that would cut down infantry as the vehicle passed through their ranks, that would turn cavalry charge into mechanical harvesting, that represented warfare at its most impersonal and most brutal. And the designs for fortifications, star-shaped arrangements that eliminated blind spots where attackers could shelter, that created interlocking fields of fire, that anticipated by centuries the principles of military architecture that would dominate the age of artillery. Yet there is ambivalence in these designs. Some scholars suggest he deliberately included flaws in the most destructive machines, subtle errors that would prevent them from actually functioning if built, sabotaging his own creations because he recognized their terrible potential. The tank design, they note, has the cranks arranged so that the operators would work against each other, would cancel each other's effort rather than combining it, would render the vehicle immobile despite all the elaborate mechanism. Was this intentional? Did he offer the design to satisfy patrons who wanted military innovations while ensuring that this particular innovation could never actually work? The evidence is ambiguous. The flaw could be error, could be the result of sketching quickly without full consideration of how components would interact. Or it could be deliberate, could be the choice of someone who understood that knowledge is power, but that power can corrupt, that the same principles enabling creation also enable destruction, that the engineer bears some responsibility for how the engineering is used. Beneath the silence of libraries where these designs now rest in Madrid and Paris, in London and Milan, scattered across collections that have preserved them as historical curiosities while ensuring they were never built beneath that archival silence, questions persist. What did he think as he drew these machines? Did he believe in the wars they would serve? Did he consider the soldiers who would die to these devices, the cities that would fall, the destruction that would follow from making warfare more efficient? Or did he see only the intellectual challenge, the puzzle of forces and materials and mechanisms, the satisfaction of solving problem regardless of whether the solution should be implemented? There is danger in this abstraction, in treating war as engineering problem divorced from human consequence, in forgetting that the efficiency gained means lives lost more quickly, that the innovation serves destruction however elegant the mechanism. It is said that many designs were never built. Not because of moral qualms, but because patrons lacked resources, because the mechanisms required materials not yet available, because the practical difficulties of construction exceeded what could be accomplished with Renaissance technology. The tank required metal working beyond what craftsmen of the time could achieve. The giant crossbow would have been so massive that transporting it would have been nearly impossible. The scythed chariots assumed level battlefield and disciplined enemy formations that rarely existed in actual combat. So the machines remained dreams, remained sketches in notebooks, remained possibilities that were never actualized, that existed in that liminal space between conception and reality, between what could be imagined and what could actually be built and used. Perhaps this was fortunate. Perhaps the world was better for these innovations remaining theoretical, for the destructive potential staying locked in drawings rather than manifest in functioning weapons. Perhaps the gap between Renaissance technology and his imagination saved lives, prevented wars from becoming even more terrible than they already were, where memory fades into speculation about his intentions, about whether he hoped these designs would be built, or was relieved when they remained on paper. There remains the essential tension. Innovation is neutral. The principles that enable flight also enable bombing from altitude. The understanding of forces that allows bridges to span rivers also allows walls to be more efficiently destroyed. Knowledge serves whoever commands it, applies to whatever purpose the powerful choose. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The war machines whisper uncomfortable truths about the relationship between genius and destruction, between intellectual achievement and moral responsibility, between what we can create and what we should create. They whisper that brilliance is not virtue, that the ability to imagine and design does not come with wisdom about when to build and when to refrain, that the engineer who serves princes must consider what those princes will do with the engineering. The machines that dreamed of war remain dreams mostly. Some were built, the fortifications influenced military architecture, the principles of angled walls and interlocking fields of fire were adopted and refined through succeeding centuries. But the tanks and giant crossbows and scythed chariots stayed on paper, stayed in the realm of possibility rather than actuality, contributed to military theory perhaps, but not to actual battlefield destruction. Yet they haunt the notebooks. Appear between beautiful drawings of lilies and careful studies of human hands. Create strange juxtaposition, the same mind that observed flower petals with such tenderness designed machines to kill with such efficiency. The same skills that allowed him to capture Madonna's gentle smile allowed him to engineer fortifications that would doom attackers to slaughter. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the war machines, that genius is not necessarily good, that brilliance can serve any master. That the human capacity for creation and destruction are intimately linked, that they spring from the same systematic understanding of forces and materials and principles, that what enables one enables the other, that knowledge is tool that cuts both ways. The drawings wait in libraries, the war machines remain unbuilt mostly. The dreams of efficient destruction stayed dreams. But the tension persists between innovation and ethics, between what we can imagine and what we should create, between serving patrons who command and serving conscience that questions, between the intellectual satisfaction of solving problems and the moral responsibility of considering what solutions enable. Where the machines dreamed, destruction was imagined but not entirely implemented. And in that gap between design and deployment, between possibility and actuality, perhaps there is mercy, the mercy of technological limitation, of practical impossibility, of the fortunate accident that his imagination exceeded Renaissance capability to build, that his designs anticipated technologies not yet available, that the war machines remained theoretical exercises rather than actual implements of destruction. But the dreams persist, in notebooks, in sketches, in designs that show what genius applied to warfare might accomplish. And in that persistence, in that permanent record of how intelligence can serve destruction, there remains warning that innovation without wisdom is dangerous, that brilliance without ethics is morally neutral at best, that the engineer bears responsibility for the engineering even when the engineer is genius, perhaps especially when the engineer is genius, because genius amplifies consequence, makes the innovations more effective and therefore potentially more destructive. The machines that dreamed of war are sleeping still, mostly in archives on paper, in the realm of imagination rather than actuality. But they remind us that dreams can be nightmares, that some visions should perhaps remain unrealized, that the distance between what we can create and what we should create is measured not in technical capability, but in moral wisdom, the wisdom to know when to build and when to refrain, when to innovate and when to leave possibility unexplored, when to serve the patron's request, and when to quietly ensure that the most terrible designs contain flaws that make them impractical, unusable. Safely theoretical. Water obsessed him, its movement and power, its capacity to erode stone and carve landscape over geological time scales, its refusal to be permanently contained, its response to gravity and obstacle, its formation of vortex and wave, its demonstration of physical principles in visible, flowing form that could be observed and sketched and studied with patient attention that revealed patterns within patterns, complexity within apparent simplicity. It is said that he spent hours, days, years accumulated across his lifetime observing rivers and streams, standing on bridges watching current move around piers, noting how the water accelerated where channel narrowed, how it formed standing waves where flow encountered resistance, how it created spiral patterns downstream of obstacles, how the surface appearance concealed layered complexity beneath, how what looked like chaos was actually order operating at scales and speeds that made pattern difficult to perceive. The drawings show remarkable understanding. A turbulence rendered with accuracy that would not be mathematically described until centuries later, until fluid dynamics became established discipline with equations that could predict what he could only observe and sketch. The spiral patterns water makes when constrained or released, the vortices that form where fast stream enters still pool, the eddies that develop in river bends, the complex choreography of currents layering and interweaving, as water seeks paths of least resistance while also possessing force sufficient to reshape landscape given time. Whispers tell us that water became metaphor as well as subject. The way it adapts to container, takes the shape of whatever holds it without losing its essential nature. The way it finds paths around obstacles, flowing over or under or around rather than simply stopping. The way it demonstrates persistence, soft and yielding in the moment, but capable of wearing away the hardest stone through patient repetition, through the accumulated effect of countless small actions that individually accomplish nothing but collectively transform landscape. He designed systems for irrigation and flood control, for diverting rivers to serve cities that needed water supply, for draining swamps to create agricultural land, for harnessing water's power to drive mills and lift loads. The practical applications interested him, the engineering challenges of moving water from where it was to where it was needed, of protecting settlements from floods, of channeling the river's force into useful work. But beneath the practical applications lay deeper fascination with flow itself, with the principle of motion through resistance, with the way water demonstrates physical laws in form that can be observed without instruments, that speaks directly to eyes willing to watch patiently, that teaches principles of dynamics and force that apply beyond just water, that govern all movement, all transformation, all the ways matter responds to forces acting upon it. It is said that in his final years, the water drawings became almost abstract. Less concerned with practical engineering, less focused on specific rivers or channels, more interested in pure pattern, pure motion, studies that blur the boundary between observation and imagination, between what he actually saw and what he understood about deeper principles governing not just water but all flow, all movement through medium, all the ways forces propagate and dissipate and interact. These late drawings show water as almost alive, as though it possessed intention, as though the vortices and waves were not just mechanical results of forces, but expressions of something approaching will. The spirals become intricate, elaborated beyond what simple observation would yield, developed into patterns that suggest he was seeing not just surface but the underlying structure, the mathematical reality that governs how fluids behave, even when that mathematics had not yet been formulated by anyone. Beneath the silence of those final investigations into water's nature, for he worked on these studies even as his health declined, even as the paralysis claimed his right hand and made drawing difficult beneath that persistent attention, what sustained the fascination? Why return again and again to water, to its patterns and principles, to the sketching of flows and vortices that yielded no immediate practical application, that served no patron's need, that existed simply as inquiry into nature's fundamental operations, perhaps because water is everywhere? Because understanding water means understanding a principle that manifests constantly, that can be observed in fountain or river, in rain falling or ocean waves breaking, in any context where liquid moves through space. To understand water is to understand motion itself, to grasp principles that apply universally, even though they manifest most visibly in flowing streams, or perhaps because water is beautiful. Because the patterns are aesthetically satisfying independent of their scientific interest. Because the spiral has appealed to human perception since prehistoric times, appears in art and architecture across all cultures, represents something fundamental about how humans see and understand pattern and order. The water drawings are scientifically valuable, but they are also simply beautiful, worth creating for their own sake, worth the time spent observing and sketching, worth the effort even if no practical application ever followed. Where memory fades into the accumulated thousands of drawings, some clearly depicting specific streams or channels, others so abstract they could represent any water or all water, or perhaps the ideal of water existing more in thought than in any particular physical manifestation, there remains the essential commitment to observation, to patient attention, to the conviction that nature rewards close watching, that patterns reveal themselves to eyes willing to look long enough, that understanding accumulates gradually through systematic study, rather than arriving complete in sudden revelation. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The water speaks still in the drawings that captured its motion, in the observations that anticipated fluid dynamics by centuries, in the recognition that what appears chaotic is actually ordered, that turbulence follows rules even if those rules are complex, that nature operates according to principles that can be discovered through patient observation, even when the mathematics to describe those principles has not yet been invented. The river that taught him flow continues flowing. Not the specific streams he observed, those have changed course or been dammed or modified beyond recognition by 5 centuries of human intervention. But water continues behaving according to the same principles, continues demonstrating the same patterns he sketched so carefully, continues teaching the same lessons to anyone willing to watch with the attention he brought to observation. His understanding was incomplete. He did not have equations, did not have the mathematical framework that would later describe fluid dynamics precisely, could not predict quantitatively how water would behave in specific circumstances. But he saw deeply into the qualitative nature of flow, understood patterns that would later be confirmed by mathematical analysis, recognized that water's behavior was not random but lawful, not chaotic but complexly ordered. The drawings remain as testament to patient observation, to the value of sustained attention, to the recognition that understanding accumulates gradually, that nature yields its principles slowly to those willing to watch and sketch and return again and again to the same observations, refining understanding through repetition, through the patient accumulation of examples, through the slow recognition of pattern within variation. Where wonder flows, understanding follows. The water taught him about persistence, how soft can wear away hard given time. About adaptation, how flow finds path around obstacle. About complexity, how simple rules can generate intricate patterns. About beauty, how nature's operations are aesthetically satisfying independent of their functional purpose. And in learning from water, perhaps he learned about himself, about the nature of genius, about how understanding develops through the same kind of flowing persistence that water demonstrates. Not sudden, not forceful, but constant, patient, wearing away ignorance through accumulated attention, flowing around obstacles that would stop more rigid minds, finding paths to understanding that direct assault could never discover. The river continues, the water flows, the patterns persist, vortices downstream of obstacles, turbulence where currents meet, the spiral choreography of complex flow. Then the drawings remain, capturing motion in static form, translating temporal flow into spatial pattern, preserving for later eyes what his eyes saw when he stood on bridges watching water teach its lessons to anyone patient enough, attentive enough, devoted enough to learn. In Verrocchio's workshop, among other students learning the craft of paint and bronze, of how to grind pigments and prepare surfaces and copy the master's designs until hands learned the vocabulary of form and line, among these apprentices working in the customary obscurity of youth, one stood apart, not obviously at first, not in manner or appearance. But in what emerged when brush touched surface, when pigment met panel, when the technical skills he was learning became vehicle for vision that exceeded the teaching. It is said that the master assigned him a single angel in a baptism scene, a minor figure, a supporting element meant only to balance composition, to fill space, to demonstrate that the student had learned basic competencies. The kind of assignment given to promising apprentices important enough to appear in finished work that would be delivered to patron, minor enough that any deficiencies would not ruin the overall composition. The angel he painted possessed quality the other figures lacked. This was apparent immediately, even to Verrocchio himself, even to eyes that should have been proud of the student rather than threatened. The angel had presence, had luminosity, had the sense of being rather than merely representing being. The face was turned slightly, catching light, the expression suggesting awareness, the figure existing in space rather than merely being painted on surface. Whispers tell us the story that has become legend, has become part of the mythology that surrounds genius even when historical verification is uncertain. That Verrocchio, seeing what his student had achieved, put down his own brush and never painted again. That he recognized he had been surpassed, that teaching had produced master who exceeded teacher, that the logical response was to step aside, to acknowledge the transition, to accept that the future belonged to the student while the teacher would remain fixed in past, in the style and capability that was already being superseded by new vision, new technique, new understanding of what painting could accomplish. Whether the story is true is perhaps less important than what it suggests. That genius manifests early. That exceptional ability is recognizable even in minor works, even in assignments meant only to demonstrate basic competence. That there is quality in the work of great artists that transcends technical skill, that cannot be taught or learned through copying, that comes from some interior source that makes even minor figures in someone else's composition more alive than major figures painted by lesser hands. But the story also suggests pattern that would define his life. The beginning that showed such promise, the early success that seemed to predict unlimited achievement, followed by the difficulty of completion, the restlessness that made him abandon projects before they were finished, the perfectionism that made completion seem always inadequate compared to vision, that made the gap between what he imagined and what he could actually execute seem unbridgeable, that transformed potential into perpetual incompletion. The angel in Verrocchio's baptism scene was finished, was complete, was delivered to patron as part of larger composition, but it was also exception. The early work that showed what could be accomplished when assignment was limited, when the task was defined, when someone else provided the structure and he needed only to execute his portion. Later, when he was master rather than apprentice, when he received commissions for entire works rather than minor figures in someone else's composition, the pattern changed. Projects begun with enthusiasm. Preliminary drawings that showed extraordinary vision, then the slow work of execution, the difficulty of translating vision into actual paint on actual surface, the realization that what he imagined exceeded what was possible given materials and time and the limitations of physical reality. the gradual loss of interest as the initial excitement faded and only tedious execution remained. The eventual abandonment, sometimes literal, leaving works unfinished, sometimes psychological, declaring them complete when they clearly were not, when they lacked the refinement his vision demanded but his patience could no longer sustain. Beneath the silence of that workshop where he learned his craft, where other apprentices also painted angels and supporting figures, where most became competent craftsmen but none achieved his vision, beneath that formative silence, questions form. What made the difference? Why did his angel possess quality others lacked? Was it observation? Had he studied faces and light more carefully? Was it technique? Had he mastered sfumato earlier than others, the blending that made edges soft and faces seem alive? Was it simply gift, the inexplicable quality that separates genius from talent, that makes some works transcendent while others remain merely competent? The answer matters less than the recognition. That genius was present early. That the capacity for extraordinary achievement manifested in the minor work of apprenticeship. But also that early promise is not guarantee of fulfilled potential, that the arc from talented student to productive master is not straight or certain, that abilities that shine in limited assignments may struggle with the demands of complete works, with the sustained effort required to translate vision into finished reality. Where memory fades into the catalogue of unfinished works that would accumulate through his career, the adoration abandoned, the St. Jerome incomplete, the battle of Anghiari that was started and left unfinished, the countless projects begun and not completed, the angel remains, finished, perfect in its minor perfection, standing as both promise and reproach, showing what could be accomplished, suggesting what would too often remain unaccomplished as ambition exceeded capacity for completion, as vision exceeded patience for execution, as the gap between imagined and actual proved too wide to bridge consistently. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The angel speaks of potential, of the moment when ability first becomes visible, of the promise that genius shows before the difficulties of sustained production become apparent. It speaks of what could have been if every project had been as successfully completed as that first assignment, if the productive capacity had matched the visionary capacity, if the ability to finish had equaled the ability to conceive. But it also speaks of the gulf between student work and master work. When someone else defines the task and limits the scope, completion is easier. When the entire responsibility falls to single person, when vision must be maintained through months or years of execution, when no external structure constrains the ambition or defines the endpoint, then completion becomes difficult, becomes act of will as much as act of skill, becomes challenge that even genius does not automatically overcome. The apprentice who painted angels became master who struggled with completion, who created some of the most revered works in artistic history, who also left remarkable trail of unfinished projects, of visions partially realized, of potential that was fulfilled in some works and forever unrealized in others. The angel stands at the beginning of this trajectory, perfect, complete, promising everything, and perhaps that perfection was both blessing and curse, Perhaps it set standard that became burden. Perhaps the early ease made later difficulty more frustrating. Perhaps the angel that came so naturally made the subsequent struggles seem like failure when they were simply the normal difficulty of sustained production, of maintaining vision through the tedious process of execution. Where the angel waits in the Uffizi as part of Verrocchio's painting, still recognizably superior to the other figures even after 5 centuries, even viewed by eyes that have seen all his later works and can compare their potential is frozen at moment of purest promise. Before the complications, before the difficulties, before the pattern of incompletion emerged. Just the gift, evident and undeniable, showing itself in minor figure that somehow outshines everything around it through sheer quality of presence, through the luminosity that comes when technique and vision align perfectly, when hand accomplishes exactly what mind intends, when the gap between conception and execution narrows to nothing and the result is perfect in its perfection, complete in its completion, finished in every sense that matters. The angel still glows, still possesses the quality that made Verrocchio put down his brush, still demonstrates that genius announces itself, that exceptional ability is recognizable even in early work, that the distance between competence and brilliance is visible to anyone with eyes to see it. And in that persistent glow, in that continued capacity to move viewers 5 centuries after the paint dried, the angel fulfills its purpose to show what was possible, to promise what might come, to stand as evidence that the apprentice possessed gifts worth developing even if those gifts would later prove as much burden as blessing, as much source of frustration as achievement, as much reminder of potential unfulfilled as celebration of potential realized. The 13,000 pages survive, paper and binding, ink and graphite, chalk and sometimes paint, accumulated through decades of observation and speculation and systematic investigation into everything that captured his attention, which was nearly everything. Estimates suggest twice that many pages were lost or destroyed, 26,000 pages total, perhaps. 26,000 instances of thought becoming visible, of curiosity translating into marks on surface, of the internal made external through patient recording. It is said that the notebooks contain everything, not arranged or organized, not prepared for publication or even for anyone's eyes beyond his own. But everything nonetheless: observations about light and shadow, notes on how to mix pigments for particular effects, recipes for paints and varnishes, sketches of mechanical devices, anatomical studies showing interior human architecture, botanical drawings of remarkable precision, mathematical calculations, philosophical reflections, shopping lists, reminders to himself about tasks to complete and materials to acquire, jokes, fables, accounts of money spent and owed. They are not systematic, not organized into subjects or arranged chronologically with care. They are working documents, the raw material of thought captured as it occurred, the trace of mind in motion across decades of inquiry. A drawing of a flying machine appears next to a note about buying eggs. An anatomical study of the heart is followed by a geometric proof. Observations about water flow neighbor a reminder to return borrowed book. The notebooks respect no boundaries between serious and trivial, between profound and mundane, because the mind that created them made no such distinctions, saw all observations as potentially valuable, all thoughts as worth preserving. To read them to the extent they can be read, given the mirror writing and the fragmentary survival and the Renaissance Italian that requires translation and the personal abbreviations that he used without explanation to read them, is to enter consciousness itself. To see how genius thinks, which is not in finished theorems or polished prose but in questions and observations, in connections made between disparate phenomena, in the constant asking of why and how and what if. Whispers tell us that the notebooks reveal something crucial about the nature of his genius. It was not sudden breakthrough, not inspiration arriving complete, not the flash of insight that solves problem in single illuminating moment. Instead, it was sustained attention, patient observation, willingness to record carefully, to return to questions repeatedly, to allow understanding to accumulate gradually rather than expecting it to arrive complete. He observed the way light falls on sphere and how shadow defines form. He noted which pigments mixed to create which colors and how transparent glazes could modify underlying tones. He sketched bird wings from multiple angles and recorded observations about feather structure and the angle at which wing meets air during upstroke versus downstroke. He calculated the volume of geometrical solids and explored mathematical relationships between forms. He studied human anatomy and compared it to animal anatomy, noting similarities and differences, wondering about principles that governed both, and he connected, saw relationships. Recognized that studying water's flow informed understanding of hair's curl, both being examples of movement through resistance. Understood that principles governing bird flight related to forces in architectural vault, both involving load distributed across curved surface. Perceived that everything was part of single fabric of natural law waiting to be comprehended through patient observation and systematic comparison. The notebooks show mind that could not specialize, that ranged across disciplines because artificial boundaries between subjects seemed arbitrary, seemed to miss the fundamental unity of nature's operations. Physics and biology were not separate, both described matter responding to forces. Art and engineering were not distinct, both required understanding of form and proportion and how structures bear load. Medicine and mechanics overlapped. The body was machine, elegantly designed, worthy of study, using same analytical approach applied to any mechanism. Beneath the silence of archives where the notebooks now rest in Madrid and Paris, in London and Milan and Windsor, scattered across collections that have preserved them as historical treasures while also fragmenting them, separating pages that belonged together, creating artificial divisions in what was originally unified inquiry. Beneath that archival preservation, the notebooks continue speaking. They speak of curiosity that never exhausted itself, of wondering that persisted through 8 decades, of systematic attention that treated no subject as beneath notice, no question as too trivial to record, no observation as without potential value. They speak of mind that remained open, that continued learning, that never arrived at point where understanding seemed complete enough to stop questioning. It is said that scholars continue finding surprises in the notebooks. A detail previously overlooked suddenly reveals itself to researcher with appropriate background. A sketch dismissed as mechanical fantasy turns out to anticipate helicopter principle with remarkable accuracy. An anatomical drawing shows understanding of cardiovascular system that would not be independently discovered for 100 years. A botanical observation contains insight that modern biology has only recently confirmed. The echo speaks in sketches, in the swift lines that captured bird in flight with economy that suggests both confidence and deep observation. In the careful cross-hatching that built form from shadow, that demonstrated understanding of how light reveals volume. In the diagrams that showed how force transfers through lever, how weight distributes in arch, how light refracts through water, how mechanisms can amplify or redirect or transform the forces applied to them. Where memory fades into the sheer volume, 13,000 surviving pages, perhaps 26,000 originally, each one potentially containing multiple observations or sketches or notes, the total quantity of recorded thought almost incomprehensible, there remains the essential pattern, the systematic approach, the patient recording, the conviction that observation matters, that taking time to note what was seen would serve future understanding even if the immediate application was unclear. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The notebooks speak not in single voice but in chorus. The anatomist and the engineer, the artist and the scientist, the observer of water and the designer of war machines, the student of light and the investigator of human proportion, all of them the same person, all of them speaking simultaneously in the drawings and notes that survive. And in that speaking, in that polyphonic persistence across centuries, the question arises, what else did he know? What other insights lie hidden in sketches not yet fully understood? What observations have not yet been connected to modern knowledge? What relationships did he perceive that we have not yet recognized? The notebooks yield discoveries still, suggest that his investigation ranged so widely and deeply that the full extent of his understanding may never be completely recovered, that some insights may have been lost when half the pages disappeared, that we see only partial map of a mind that surveyed vast territory. The 10,000 thoughts that survive are window. Incomplete window, certainly. Fragmentary view into consciousness that produced millions of thoughts across 8+ years of life. But even this partial view is remarkable, shows the range and depth of investigation, shows the connections across disciplines, shows the systematic approach that could be applied to any question, anatomical, mechanical, artistic, mathematical, and that yielded understanding through patient observation and careful recording. Where the notebooks rest now preserved, digitized, available to scholars and eventually to anyone with internet connection, the mirror writing no longer barrier to access, they continue their work, continue teaching. Continue demonstrating that understanding accumulates gradually, that curiosity serves no single discipline, that the patient observer who records carefully and thinks systematically can investigate anything, can contribute to knowledge even when working alone, even when not part of academic institution, even when the investigation is driven solely by personal wondering rather than by external requirement or expectation of publication. The pages are fragile now, 5 centuries old. Handled carefully, stored in controlled conditions, but they persist. The ink has faded but remains legible mostly. The paper has yellowed but holds together. The thoughts captured in that mirror script continue waiting for eyes willing to look, for minds willing to engage, for the next generation of investigators who will find in those 10,000 surviving thoughts the seeds of new understanding, the inspiration for new questions, the reminder that systematic attention to nature's operations yields knowledge regardless of century, regardless of technology. Regardless of whether the investigation has support beyond the investigator's own conviction that understanding is worth pursuing. The notebooks that held 10,000 thoughts still hold them, patient, fragmentary, incomplete, but present. Speaking still to anyone willing to learn the language, not just the mirror writing, though that is part of it, but the deeper language of systematic observation, of patient recording, of the conviction that everything is worth noting because everything connects, because nature is unified even when human categorization creates artificial boundaries, because curiosity properly directed will find patterns and principles wherever it looks carefully enough, long enough, systematically enough. In Amboise in the Loire Valley, in the manor house provided by French king who had invited him to spend his final years in comfort and respect befitting genius, the old man continued working though his right hand had become paralyzed. Stroke perhaps, or some other neurological event that robbed him of the ability to draw and paint with the facility that had defined his life, that had been his primary language for speaking what words could not adequately express. The left hand still functioned. Could still write the mirror script, could still sketch though with less precision than before, with the tremor that comes when non-dominant hand attempts tasks that dominant hand always handled, with the frustration of knowing exactly what should appear on page, but having the execution fall short of intention. It is said that he focused on conversation rather than production. The young King Francis I visited frequently, valued his presence more than his output, wanted the prestige of having Leonardo da Vinci at his court, wanted to say that genius lived under French protection in French manner, regardless of whether genius was still producing works to justify the title. They talked about architecture, about festivals and pageants, about designs for palaces and canals and ideal cities where all the problems of urban living would be solved through careful planning and engineering. Visions that would never be realized but that pleased the king, that demonstrated the mind was still active even as the body declined, that the systematic investigation could continue even when the actual building and painting became impossible. He had brought little with him to France. The Mona Lisa among the few possessions, still being refined or at least still capable of accepting refinement, still not finished or perhaps finished but still open to adjustment. A few notebooks, some drawings, the essential tools of investigation and creation, but much had been left behind in Italy. Much had been sold or given away or simply abandoned in the various workshops and residences he had occupied over 70 years of peripatetic existence. Whispers tell us that he knew time was limited, that the paralysis was warning of worse to come, that the body that had served him for 8 decades was approaching its limit, was beginning the final decline that no amount of observation or engineering could prevent or reverse. He had studied death in the bodies he dissected, had seen what happens when the animating principle departs and only mechanism remains. Had perhaps wondered about his own death, about the moment when consciousness would cease and he would become subject rather than investigator, when others might open his body and study its interior architecture the way he had studied so many others. The autumn of 1519 found him weakened, able to move around the house but no longer able to travel, to walk the distances he had once covered with ease, to maintain the restless investigation that had taken him from Florence to Milan to Rome and now to France, that had kept him moving throughout his life, never settling, never finding place that could contain his interests and investigations. He made practical arrangements, dictated his will document disposing of property and artwork, making provisions for servants and students, requesting burial in specific church with specific ceremonies. The man who had spent lifetime investigating everything from water flow to human anatomy to the principles of flight approached his own ending with the same careful attention he had brought to all phenomena. Death was simply another transition, another transformation to be noted and prepared for, another instance of matter changing state according to natural law. It is said that King Francis was with him at the end, or wanted to be, or claimed to be in later telling, though the historical evidence is uncertain. The story has the young king cradling the old genius's head as death approached, honoring the man who had honored France by choosing to spend his final years under French protection. Whether true or legend, the story suggests something about how he was valued not just as producer of artworks or designer of mechanisms, but as presence, as consciousness worth honoring, as genius whose conversation and vision had value beyond any particular creation. He died on May 2, 1519, at age 67, not especially old by modern standards but reasonable lifespan for Renaissance. He had seen much change in the world, had contributed to some of that change. Had spent lifetime investigating, creating, questioning, refusing to accept mystery as permanent when patient observation might reveal principles. Beneath the silence of that French manner for silence came finally the consciousness that had ranged so widely finally ceasing, the investigations ending not because questions were answered, but because the investigator could no longer continue beneath that final silence. What remained? The artwork scattered across Italy and now France. The notebooks filling shelves and chests, the accumulated observations of decades, the students who had learned from him, the patrons who had supported him, the mechanical designs and architectural visions and anatomical studies, the unfinished projects and unrealized plans, the gap between what he had imagined and what he had actually accomplished. The house where autumn came early holds only memory now. The manor still stands closed-loose, preserved as museum, visited by tourists who want to see where he spent his final years, where he died, where the genius finally fell silent. The rooms have been restored or reimagined. The furnishings are period appropriate but not his actual possessions. The space has become memorial rather than residence, symbol rather than lived reality. But perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps the house should be memorial. Because what mattered was never the place but the consciousness that briefly inhabited it, never the physical location but the investigations that continued there until they couldn't, never the comfort of the manor but the final burst of conversation and vision before silence came. Where memory fades into the practical details of burial and will execution and the dispersal of possessions to various recipients, there remains the essential recognition. That genius ended, that consciousness ceased. That the systematic investigation that had continued for 8 decades finally stopped not because it was complete, but because the investigator could no longer investigate, because the body that had been tool and vehicle became finally inadequate, because biology has limits that even genius cannot overcome. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The house speaks of endings, of the recognition that all investigation is temporary, all consciousness is mortal, all production must eventually cease. It speaks of making arrangements, of accepting inevitability, of facing death with the same attention brought to all other phenomena as interesting final transformation, as worthy of note and preparation, as natural process rather than affront to be denied. The autumn that came early to that French manor came for Leonardo as it comes for everyone. The only variable is timing. The only question is what gets done before the autumn arrives. And by that measure his autumn came late enough that the accumulated work was substantial, the investigations were numerous, the contributions were significant, but also early enough that much remained undone, projects unfinished, visions unrealized, questions asked but not answered. The gap between imagination and execution remained at the end, remained unfilled, remained testimony to the human condition where our reach always exceeds our grasp, where vision always outpaces capability, where there is never quite enough time to accomplish everything that might be accomplished. Where the house stands now preserved, visited, transformed into museum that tries to capture something of what it was like when he lived there, when genius inhabited those rooms, when the conversations with the king occurred and the final refinements to Mona Lisa were attempted, and the notebooks continued filling with observations even as the hand weakened there. Autumn is permanent. The season that came early has never left. The house remains in perpetual autumn, in the state of ending, in the moment before silence, frozen in time as memorial to the consciousness that briefly made it significant. The house where autumn came early teaches its lesson still, that endings come, that preparation matters, that facing inevitable with attention and care is perhaps the final demonstration of systematic investigation applied to ultimate mystery. That death is not exception to natural law, but final instance of it, final transformation that even genius must undergo, final silence that claims all voices eventually regardless of what those voices accomplished before falling still. He was buried in the church of Saint Florentin in Amboise, with ceremony befitting his status as friend to the king, with recognition of his achievements and his contribution to the French court. The burial was documented, the location noted, the grave presumably marked according to the customs of the time when someone of significance died and warranted proper memorial. But the grave would not remain undisturbed, would not maintain its integrity through the centuries that followed. The French Revolution brought destruction to many churches, to symbols of old order and royal privilege, to anything that represented the world before revolution remade everything. Saint Florentin was damaged, then later demolished entirely. The burials were scattered or lost. The records became confused or were destroyed. The careful documentation of who was buried where became unreliable, became fragments, became historical puzzle with missing pieces. It is said that by the 19th century, no one could say with certainty where he rested, whether any bones remained at the original burial site, whether the grave had been disturbed during the Revolution or the subsequent demolition, whether his remains had been moved, scattered, lost to the chaos that had obliterated so many monuments and disrupted so many graves. The location was known approximately somewhere in the area where Saint Florentin had stood, but precisely, specifically, with confidence that would allow pilgrims to visit or scholars to verify, the grave's location had become mystery. In 1863, during excavation of the site, bones were found. A skull and some other fragments, buried where records suggested his grave should be, at depth consistent with Renaissance burial practices, in location that matched what fragmentary documentation indicated. Were these his remains? The evidence was circumstantial. The skull was studied, measured, compared to what was known or believed about his physical appearance. The other bones were examined for signs of injury or disease that might correlate with biographical details. Probably, possibly, perhaps the identification could never be certain. 5 centuries had passed. The grave had been disturbed, the church demolished, the area excavated and reburied multiple times. DNA testing was centuries in the future. The identification relied on educated guess, on probability rather than proof, on the assessment that these bones were more likely his than anyone else's given location and circumstance. Whispers tell us that the bones were reburied in 1874 in the chapel of St. Hubert in Amboise Castle, marked with monument declaring them Leonardo's remains. The tomb is impressive marble and inscription, recognition of genius, claim that these are the authentic remains of Leonardo da Vinci, that pilgrims are visiting the actual grave of the actual person, that this is not memorial or cenotaph but burial site, but uncertainty persists. Some scholars doubt the identification, suggest the bones could belong to anyone buried in that crowded churchyard where St. Florentin once stood, argue that certainty is impossible given the disruptions and the passage of time. Without DNA comparison to verified relatives, without any definitive proof beyond circumstantial evidence of location and timing, the identification remains probable but not certain, likely but not confirmed, the best guess rather than established fact. Perhaps this is fitting end for one who left so much unfinished, whose work was dispersed and fragmented, whose notebooks were scattered across Europe and whose paintings hang in different museums, whose legacy is everywhere and nowhere. Perhaps the uncertainty about where he rests is appropriate conclusion to life that was peripatetic, that moved from city to city, that never settled, that left traces in many places but belonged definitively to none. The grave that was lost and found or was found but remains partly lost because the finding is uncertain speaks to the difficulty of preservation across centuries, to the vulnerability of physical remains, to the chaos that historical disruptions cause for efforts to maintain continuity with past. The French Revolution was necessary, perhaps, was response to genuine injustice and suffering, but it also destroyed much that was worth preserving, much that provided connection to history, much that allowed later generations to touch something tangible from the past. And so the bones rest in St. Hubert Chapel, marked as Leonardo's, visited by tourists who assume they are viewing his actual grave, treated as authentic even though the authentication is uncertain. Perhaps the bones are his. The probability is reasonable. The location and circumstances suggest these are more likely his remains than anyone else's. But proof is absent, certainty is impossible. The grave that was lost was found, but the finding is shadowed by doubt. Beneath the silence of the chapel where the remains rest whoever they belong to, whether Leonardo's or some other person's whose burial happened to be in the location where his was documented beneath that marble and inscription, what matters? Does it matter whether these are actually his bones? Does the authenticity of the remains affect the legacy, the achievements, the accumulated investigations and creations that exist independent of where his physical body finally decomposed? Perhaps not. Perhaps the grave is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is the work, not the worker. What persists is the notebooks and paintings and designs, not the bones that once supported the consciousness that created them. The grave is for the living more than the dead provides location to visit, to contemplate, to feel connection to genius across centuries. Whether the bones are actually his or not, the grave serves this purpose, provides this focal point, allows pilgrims to stand in specific place and think about specific person and feel that they are in presence of something significant. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The uncertain grave speaks of the difficulty of certainty, of the way historical evidence often provides probability rather than proof, of the limits of knowledge especially across centuries when documentation is fragmentary and disruptions have scattered what once was carefully arranged. It speaks of the difference between what we know and what we believe we know, between verified fact and reasonable assumption. Where the bones rest his or someone else's, authentic or mistaken identification there, certainty ends and faith begins. faith that the identification is correct, faith that these are his remains, faith that visiting this grave creates connection to genius across the unbridgeable distance of 5 centuries. Perhaps faith is sufficient. Perhaps the probability is good enough. Perhaps the grave serves its purpose regardless of whether the bones are certainly, definitively, provably his. The monument declares identity with confidence the evidence does not entirely support. But monuments often simplify, often present as certain what is actually probable, often serve the needs of the present more than they accurately represent the past. The people who visit expect to see Leonardo's grave. They expect certainty, expect authenticity, expect that the tomb they view contains the actual remains of the actual person. To tell them the identification is uncertain, is probable but not proven, is best guess rather than established fact. This serves historical accuracy but compromises the emotional and symbolic purpose the grave serves. So the bones rest in St. Hubert Chapel, marked as Leonardo's, visited as his grave, accepted as authentic by most who come to pay respects. And perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps the uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps the grave that was lost and found and remains partly uncertain is perfect emblem for genius who was never entirely present, never fully committed to any single place or project, never entirely knowable even to contemporaries, certainly less knowable across centuries that separate us from his time. Where memory and bone meet, questions persist. Are these his remains? Does it matter? Does the grave serve its purpose regardless of certainty? Does the connection we feel when visiting the tomb depend on authenticity or on our willingness to believe, on our desire for tangible connection to past even when that connection is mediated by uncertainty? The grave that was lost and found teaches final lesson about certainty and doubt, about the limits of historical knowledge, about the difference between what we can prove and what we choose to believe. The bones rest somewhere, whether in St. Hubert Chapel or scattered in the earth where St. Florentin once stood, or lost entirely to the disruptions of revolution and time. His consciousness is gone regardless, has been gone for 5 centuries, will never return regardless of where the bones rest. What remains is the work, the notebooks and paintings, the investigations and designs, the accumulated evidence of systematic curiosity applied across disciplines, of genius that ranged widely and thought deeply and left traces that persist independent of physical remains. The grave is symbol more than substance, is place to visit more than authentic burial site, is memorial that serves the living's need for connection regardless of whether the bones it contains are certainly his, or only probably his, or perhaps not his at all. And in that uncertainty, in that probable but not certain identification, the grave becomes metaphor, for the way historical knowledge is always partial, for the way certainty is luxury rarely available across centuries, for the way we construct connection to pass through combination of evidence and faith, of probability and belief, of what we can prove and what we choose to accept because the alternative is disconnection, is loss of tangible link to genius whose influence persists but whose physical presence is irretrievably gone. The grave remains, visited, honored, marked with monument that declares certainty the evidence does not fully support, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the grave serves its purpose. Perhaps the bones, whoever they belonged to, can rest in peace, while the consciousness that once inhabited them rests in the work that survives, in the notebooks and paintings, in the systematic investigations that continue teaching centuries after the investigator fell silent. 5 centuries after his death, the notebooks still yield surprises. A scholar notices detail previously overlooked, recognizes that a sketch dismissed as mechanical fantasy actually anticipates helicopter principle with remarkable accuracy, sees that an anatomical drawing shows understanding of cardiovascular system that would not be independently rediscovered for 100 years, notices that a botanical observation contains insight that modern biology has only recently confirmed. It is said that his hand is gone, but the marks remain, the swift lines that captured bird in flight, the careful cross-hatching that built form from shadow, the diagrams that showed how force transfers through lever, how weight distributes in arch, how light refracts through water. Speaking in visual language that transcends the mirrored Italian surrounding them, communicating directly through image even when words are untranslatable. The echo speaks not in single voice but in chorus. The anatomist and the engineer, the artist and the scientist, the observer of water and the designer of war machines, all of them the same person, all of them speaking simultaneously in the drawings that remain, in the sketches that persist, in the accumulated visual record of 8 decades of systematic observation. Museums and libraries hold the notebooks now. I preserve them in controlled environments where temperature and humidity are carefully regulated, where handling is minimal, where light exposure is limited to prevent further fading. The pages are digitized high-resolution images available online, allowing anyone with internet connection to view the sketches without risking damage to originals. The mirror writing is transcribed and translated, making the words accessible to scholars who don't read Renaissance Italian or don't want to decipher the reversed script. But even with this accessibility, even with digital reproduction and transcription, the notebooks continue revealing. Because observation is infinite, there is always more to see, always another detail to notice, always another connection to make between sketch in the notebook and modern understanding that confirms or extends or finds unexpected resonance with observation made 5 centuries ago. Whispers tell us that what he drew often preceded what he could build, that his mechanical designs anticipated technologies that wouldn't exist for centuries, that his anatomical observations preceded medical understanding by decades or generations, that his investigations into flight and water and light and the countless subjects that captured his attention often arrived at conclusions that would not be independently confirmed until modern instruments and methodologies made such confirmation possible. This creates strange relationship between past and present. His sketches are historical artifacts, certainly products of specific time and place, created using Renaissance materials and reflecting Renaissance understanding. But they are also somehow contemporary, somehow relevant to current investigations, somehow still teaching because the questions he asked and the observations he recorded remain pertinent regardless of century. The helicopter sketch is famous example. The aerial screw, he called it mechanism that would theoretically lift itself into air through rotation, through the screw-like blade pushing downward against air resistance and generating upward force as Newton's third law demands. The drawing shows clear understanding of principle, even though the materials available in Renaissance couldn't produce functional version, even though human power source wouldn't generate sufficient force, even though countless technical problems would need solving before helicopter could actually fly. But the principle was correct. The observation that rotating airfoil could generate vertical lift was accurate. 4 centuries later, when engines and materials made helicopter practical, when the technical problems were solved through modern engineering and manufacturing, when vertical flight became actual rather than theoretical, then his sketch was recognized as anticipation, as evidence that genius had seen path forward even when that path wouldn't be traveled for centuries. And this pattern repeats. The anatomical studies showing cardiovascular systems structure anticipate Harvey's discovery of blood circulation. The observations about moon's light being reflected sunlight anticipate astronomical understanding. The notes about fossils being ancient sea creatures found in mountains anticipate geological concepts about land rising from ocean over vast time spans. Again and again, his observations align with understanding that wouldn't be general knowledge until long after his death. Beneath the silence of libraries where the notebooks rest, behind the glass and the controlled environment and the reverent handling, the sketches continue teaching. Not just historical lessons about Renaissance art or 15th century mechanical design, but contemporary lessons about observation and curiosity, about systematic investigation yielding understanding, about the value of recording carefully what one sees because those observations might contribute to knowledge in ways that aren't immediately apparent. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. His voice preserved in sketches rather than recordings, speaking through images rather than words, echoes still for anyone willing to look carefully at the drawings, willing to see beyond the historical artifact to the investigation in progress, willing to recognize that systematic attention to natural phenomena yields insights regardless of whether those insights align with contemporary understanding. The echo speaks of persistence, of returning again and again to the same subjects: water, flight, human anatomy, mechanical advantage, refining understanding through repeated observation, allowing knowledge to accumulate gradually rather than expecting complete understanding to arrive suddenly. The notebooks show this persistence explicitly: multiple drawings of the same subject from different angles, notes building on previous notes, observations that correct or extend earlier observations, the gradual refinement of understanding through sustained attention. And the echo speaks of connection, of seeing relationships across disciplines, of recognizing that principles governing water flow relate to principles governing air flow, that both are fluids responding to forces according to same underlying physics, of understanding that studying bird flight informs understanding of mechanical flight, that nature's solutions suggest engineering possibilities, of perceiving unity where others saw only separate subjects, separate disciplines, separate domains of investigation. Where memory fades into the specific examples, this sketch of mechanical device, that observation about botanical structure, these calculations about geometric relationships, there remains the essential pattern. The systematic approach, the patient observation, the conviction that nature rewards careful attention, that patterns reveal themselves to eyes willing to watch long enough, that understanding accumulates through sustained investigation rather than arriving complete in single revelation. Perhaps the greatest echo is methodological rather than specific. Perhaps what persists most powerfully is not any particular sketch or observation, but the example itself, the demonstration that curiosity can be sustained across lifetime, that investigation can range across disciplines, that systematic attention yields understanding regardless of subject matter, that the questions worth asking are everywhere for those willing to look carefully and record faithfully what they see. The sketches wait in their archival homes, patient, available, ready to teach anyone willing to learn the language, not just the mirror writing, though that's part of it, but the deeper language of systematic observation, of curiosity applied methodically, a vision that sees connections and patterns and principles where casual observation sees only isolated phenomena, and new discoveries continue. Every few years, some scholar notices something previously missed. Some detail that changes understanding of a design, some observation that turns out to align with modern knowledge in unexpected way, some sketch that reveals more careful understanding than previous interpreters recognized. The notebooks are not exhausted. They continue yielding because they were created by consciousness that observed so carefully and recorded so faithfully that even centuries later, even after countless examinations, there remains more to find. This is perhaps the ultimate vindication of his approach. That patient observation and faithful recording create permanent value, that what he saw and sketched 5 centuries ago continues relevant, continues teaching, continues rewarding careful examination. That the echo doesn't fade but rather gains resonance as modern knowledge provides contexts for recognizing insights that were ahead of their time, observations that anticipated discoveries, investigations that asked questions science wouldn't formally address for generations. The echo that speaks in sketches will continue speaking, as long as the notebooks survive, as long as scholars examine them, as long as anyone looks at the drawings and wonders what he saw, what he understood, what connections he made between observation and principle. The voice is visual but not silent. The communication is through line and shadow but not unclear. The teaching persists through marks on paper made 500 years ago but not outdated. Where wonder and investigation meet, echoes form. And his echo captured in sketches, preserved in notebooks, speaking through visual language that transcends time and translation, that echo continues calling. Calling to the curious, calling to the systematic, calling to anyone willing to observe patiently, record faithfully, investigate methodically, see connections across apparent boundaries. The echo speaks in sketches, in drawings, in the accumulated visual record of consciousness that saw deeply and recorded carefully and left traces that persist. Listen. Look, learn, the echo continues, patient, visual, eternal. Where genius worked, marks remain, and in those marks, in those sketches, in those patient recordings of what eyes saw and mind understood there, the echo speaks still. Rest now, let the images fade gently. Let the questions dissolve into sleep. The notebooks close, the echoes soften, the sketches wait patiently for morning. Where wonder dwelt, marks remain. And in those marks, across 5 centuries, genius speaks still, soft, visual, inviting us to look as carefully as he looked, to wonder as persistently as he wondered, to investigate as systematically as he investigated. The mirror writing reflects, the sketches teach, the echo continues. Good night.